Okay, so I wanted to cap this off because when you spend the whole day serving as the moderator, you kind of have to sort of keep your opinions to yourself, though I hope I failed at that once or twice today. It's always nice to have a go at that. But I wanted to use the closing minutes to present a little more of what the centre's view on this is, and to give you the chance to kind of ask any wildcard questions that didn't fit neatly into any of the 4 boxes that we've given you today. So I didn't mention at the start, my name's Nick Wallace. I'm a senior policy analyst at the centre, and I manage the centre's EU research. And that's often quite an interesting position to be in, because I come back to the point about national strategies. For the Internet of Things, the European context provides a very interesting environment for deploying policy solutions that have been developed in other environments. The presence of I mean I don't care whether you think the EU is intergovernmental or supranational or any of that. It creates unique opportunities for very unique kinds of policies and problems. We take the view that there are 3 key areas in the Internet of Things, which translates into urban Internet of Things in smart cities, where there absolutely needs to be some level of either state or European investment. I say state because we're usually talking about nation states when we look at this. But this, of course, doesn't rule out the role of the EU as a coordinating force, because we perceive 3 problems. One is something I touched on in one of the earlier panels, that many forms of the Internet of Things have social benefits that outweigh individual benefits. Smart meters are the classic example, and one that the EU has helped to fix, where the social benefits of reduced energy use don't provide much of an incentive for an individual to invest in their own smart meter. Maybe you want to invest in getting greater control of your energy use, but the fact is most people don't do it. So that's one example. Network effects is the kind of the usual tag that's put on this. The second issue is mutually dependent technologies. I mentioned toll roads before. If you think about smart, and I don't necessarily mean autonomous, but connected cars that interact with sensors in the road, those are mutually dependent technologies. There's not a lot of point investing in a car that's full of all these smart and interactive sensors if you don't have a road with sensors that it can interact and communicate with. But if no one's driving these connected cars, why would anyone invest in a connected road? But if there's no connected road, that reduces your interest in buying a connected car in the first place. So again, this is an area where there needs to be public sector investment in infrastructure to support these markets. Payments are another example where I suppose we're coming towards this being resolved. If you think about contactless payments, the technology was there and was available long before it took off. It was a little easier to resolve because it was a relatively low-cost solution for banks to start putting those contactless readers into your cards that could lead to investment elsewhere. The third problem takes a little more explaining. We call it, I say we call it, it is called the penguin effect. And this is where if you, I don't watch many nature programs, but there is a phenomenon that's been recorded where penguins in the Antarctic stand before waters in which they need to fish to feed, but because they don't know whether there's going to be predators lurking in the water, they stand around waiting for the first one to dive in and see if he gets eaten or if he gets to eat before the others come in. And there is some element of this in smart cities and in urban IoT, and it comes back to this, the adages about who's risk averse and who isn't. The fact, and I said this came up on the last panel. The fact is forget whatever we say about Europeans being risk averse. If you're making an investment, there's always going to be a degree of concern about risks, especially if you're the first mover. If it's something that has never been done before, I think a lot of entrepreneurs who do invest in this might admit to being a little bit crazy for being the first mover. And there is an argument there that, especially in smart cities, that low-level investment in pilot projects, for example, by state actors, is a small way of introducing these first risks. But this comes back to the point on scaling. We may need to find something a little more substantial to build this up. The point in this is there is a role for the state in determining some areas of its own use of Internet of Things. And we argue that if the Internet of Things is rolled out in public services and in public sector property, this would spur private sector investment elsewhere. The other thing that wasn't really mentioned through the day but came up in the final panel, which also fits in with specifically our EU research, is the importance of national data strategies. I mentioned earlier that France was the first country to introduce a national chief data officer. Now, without getting into whether or not we sort of think that the French chief data officer has implemented the level of change that we'd like to see, we do think that it is wise for member states to implement to create roles for national data officers who could make the case in government for effective use of data. We also think that the European Council should convene these people in an independent advisory board to help support European policy on data, which I think has a tendency to get caught up in hypothetical problems. What might go wrong, which often gets in the way of how do we make it do what we know it could get right. And I think that without undermining those roles, there is also a strong argument to say that cities should do something similar, and that there should be feedback from local level up to national and then into the European Union. Finally, we also, and this is obviously touching on sort of our particular interest as a data think tank, that those of you familiar with the H2020's Lighthouse projects, the ones that are sort of earmarked for further development, we think that the priorities should be those that are data-driven, because once that data becomes available, it supports investment in other projects later. So this is sort of a broad policy outline of where we are on smart cities and IoT, and as I think you probably noticed from the discussions, that I see smart cities as being a nice way of encapsulating arguments that actually go well beyond smart cities when we're talking about the rights to access and control data, when we're talking about public and private sector responsibility for investment and privacy. These are it's a nice way of bringing them all together. Now, with sort of the few minutes we had left, a few of you came to me in the lobby with different kinds of questions, and I asked you to save them until the end, because I thought it would be nice to have just a few minutes to take on any wildcard questions that weren't addressed in the panels or that didn't fit. So I'm going to throw it open to you, and you can throw back at me whatever it is you feel like throwing. I mean, if we don't have any questions to finish the day, I'll happily close, and you can bring those to me privately afterwards. We have one here, please.
Yes, the smart cities are made for citizens.
Could you grab your microphone, please? Thank you. It's the one in front. The cylinder in front. That's the one.
Thank you. The smart cities are meant to help citizens, their citizens. Now, a number of those citizens, and that was mentioned before, might be older citizens or citizens with not the right skills, competences to work in this new environment. So what can cities do to help their citizens acquire also these new competences?
Yep. I mean, digital skills could be a conference in its own right. I would say that when you're talking about and this kind of comes back to what we've seen before about how can data make bureaucracy less annoying. If whatever government implements is something if it requires a great deal of special skills of citizens, if it's taxing of citizens' effort and time, it's probably going to struggle. I mean, I think that with the kinds of solutions that we're talking about, such as those that are based in smartphones, I'm not entirely sure it's a skills problem. I don't think the skills required to operate a smartphone or a simple app that's designed for ordinary people is best seen of as a skills problem in the labour market sense of skills. But I do acknowledge that we have people, elderly people in society, who might not be comfortable using a smartphone. I think some of that is less of a skills problem as a design problem. There are companies out there producing hardware that's designed for people who are not comfortable with the sort of the mainstream technology. That might be because they're old and they're not used to this kind of thing, or it may be because if they have some kind of impairment that makes it more difficult for them to interact with them. I mean, you now have a market for Braille tablets, for example, that can actually represent Braille on the screen in combination with a mainstream tablet browser. But and I said, I hope this doesn't sound cold, but there's also the case that I think it's a short-term problem. I think generationally, we will get to a point where the elderly generation are people who don't have any special digital skills that could help them in the labour market sense, but have enough to manage a smartphone. I mean, I think my parents are in their 60s, and they don't have advanced digital skills, but they can operate a smartphone. They're just about of that kind of baby boomer generation that arrived, just about late enough to get used to this at a later stage in life, whereas their parents certainly never did that. It was almost kind of like it was a generation out. But I agree that this is something that we have to think about, certainly for the next 20, 30 years or so when we're dealing with smart cities, that the things need to be made easy for people. I mean, Albert mentioned this as well earlier when he said that, voice is still a thing. We still need to talk to people and explain things to them. I would say, I mean, if you take the example of, in the UK, a lot of councils adopted one-stop shops for council services. The idea being that if you wanted something from your local government, you shouldn't have to have a whole book of numbers to call. There should be one phone number where you can call and ask. Now, it may well be that digital interactions replaces some of those call center interactions, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still have a call center that people can ring into. But then, of course, a lot of people aren't comfortable talking on the phone either. Some people might actually prefer an app, including some of the people that you refer to. I think that whenever we're talking about data innovation in cities, and especially in local government services that tend to be quite close to people, it needs to be about opening up people's options and not shepherding people into a particular gate that they might not want to walk through. I hope that answers your question. Anything anybody else wants to say on that? Okay, if not, it's 10 to 5, so I hope the wine might be ready. I'm sure you all noticed that on the agenda, that there will be wine. So I'd like to finish by, again, thanking our sponsors. It's Open Data Soft and CA Technologies. I'd also like to thank EU Observer, our media partner. We're a non-profit think tank. We rely on donations, so events like this are very difficult to pull off without support. So I don't know if they're still in the room, but I'd like to thank those buddies for supporting us today. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and contributing your ideas. And this is a conversation we'd like to keep going. As I said, we're still fairly new in Brussels, but we're putting out a lot of research and a lot of opinion on European policy. And I went into think tanks because I like having arguments. So please do keep in touch with me, and please do argue with me as I put out things that you do or don't agree with. Thank you very much, everybody.